The winter wind clawed at the cabin walls long before dawn, rattling the shutters like an impatient memory. Elias Ward woke before the cold could settle too deep in his bones, breath rising in pale ghosts above his lips. For a moment, he stayed still beneath the weight of blankets, listening to the cracking timbers and the heavy, endless quiet of the frontier. 3 winters alone. 3 winters since the world hollowed itself out. He sat up slowly, the motion tight, stiff, years older than he looked. He struck a match, lit the single lantern beside his bed, and watched its flame struggle before blooming steady. That tired little flame still reflected in his eyes the same way it had when Clara used to tease him. "Light suits you, Eli. You always look like you're hoping for something." He hadn't hoped in a long time. The floor chilled his feet through his socks as he crossed to the window. Snow pressed thick against the glass, burying the world in white silence. He scraped a hand across the fogged pane and stared outward. Forest, frozen river, the long unused road, empty as ever. He whispered it anyway. The same words he said every morning, like a ritual carved into his ribs. Still here, still waiting. The cabin carried no answer. He dressed in the half-light, boots stiff with cold leather, coat heavy on his shoulders. He moved like a man who'd learned to survive without expecting anything to return warmth to him. Coffee came next, the grounding habit of a man trying not to disappear inside himself. He pumped water from the barrel, coaxed the fire to life, and stood in that flickering orange glow until his fingertips stung awake. The house around him was a museum of a life that never finished. 2 small wooden horses sat on the mantel, hand-carved, waiting for hands that never held them. A cradle Elias had built in the final weeks of Clara's pregnancy rested, untouched in the corner, covered in a quilt she'd sewn, each stitch tender and hopeful. A shawl she wore the last day he saw her hung by the door. Some days he swore he still smelled her lavender soap. Coffee finally steamed in the tin cup. He sat at the table across from the empty chair that used to be hers. The lantern burned between them like an apology to the universe. Outside the wind howled. Inside, Elias whispered to a chair that didn't answer back. "They said you died," he murmured, voice cracking. "Said the child didn't make it either." He traced the rim of the cup with his thumb, a trembling motion. "But I still keep the light on, just in case." The door remained closed, the world silent. He drank in small sips, letting the heat settle in him like courage. He would chop wood today, maybe tend the fence, maybe ride to the settlement for supplies, or maybe he'd do none of that. Days had begun to bleed into one another so completely he wasn't sure if he'd been here 3 years or 3 lifetimes. Loneliness steals time the way frost steals color. He stepped outside to gather more wood from the shed. Snow sank beneath his boots with a low crunch, the cold bit so sharp it felt alive. He worked until sweat dampened his shirt despite the freezing air. The rhythmic chop of the axe was the only sound cutting through the winter hush. Halfway through stacking the wood, he stopped. A noise. Soft. Not wind, not animal. Something closer. Footsteps? A crack of a branch? Elias straightened, breath hitching in his throat. The road was in view from here. Long, narrow, half-covered in drifts. No one came this far without a reason. Not in winter. Not toward a house that had nothing left to offer. He waited. Listened. Silence. He shook his head and returned to the wood pile, until he heard it again. Faint, uneven, small. Footsteps. Definitely footsteps. He gripped the axe a little tighter. Another sound followed. Lighter, quick, almost like, was that humming? A child's humming? His heart bucked against his ribs in a way he didn't recognize anymore. He dropped the axe, snow puffing where it landed, and moved toward the road slowly, each step careful, breath pluming like smoke. At first he saw nothing but white. Then 2 small silhouettes emerged through the veil of falling snow. A girl in an oversized brown coat, boots mismatched, hair tangled beneath a wool hat. Beside her walked a boy, younger, shorter, dragging a small wooden wagon that looked ready to fall apart. They trudged forward with stubborn determination, cheeks reddened raw from wind. Elias froze. The girl lifted her head first. Her eyes caught him, blue, piercing, familiar in a way that made the air leave his lungs, the same exact shade Clara had. The boy had Clara's nose, Clara's chin. Both children stopped a dozen paces away. The girl swallowed hard, squared her shoulders the way only a brave child does, and spoke. "Are you Elias Ward?" He nodded slowly, unable to form words. The girl breathed out in relief, like she had been holding her lungs tight for miles. "Good," she whispered. "Mama said to find you." Elias's vision blurred, the world tilting. "Who? Who is your mother?" he forced out. The girl stepped closer. Snow clung to her lashes. "Clara Ward," she said softly. "She told us you're our papa." Time cracked in half. The world stilled. Elias could only stare, lips parted, chest heaving like he'd been running. The boy reached into the wagon and pulled something out with two hands. A wooden rattle, smooth, unfinished, carved with initials, EW plus CW. The very rattle Elias had carved the night before. Clara went into labor.
How?
His voice broke completely. He could barely breathe. Where is Clara?" The girl's eyes shone with something that felt too steady for someone so young. "She's coming," the girl whispered. "She said to tell you she never stopped looking for home." Elias staggered back a step. "They told me she died," he whispered. "They told me, both of you, didn't make it." The kids exchanged a small, sad look. The girl clutched her brother's hand. "They told Mama that too," she said. "But she didn't." Something inside Elias cracked open so violently he had to brace a hand on his knee. The girl's lip trembled. "Can we come in? We've been walking since yesterday. Mama said the house with the lantern in the window would be yours." The lantern. The ritual. The hope he thought he'd buried. He couldn't speak. But he stepped aside. The children slipped past him into the cabin, tracking snow across the floor. They went straight to the fire, shivering in front of the heat, hands splayed toward it. The boy set down the wagon gently, as if it carried something sacred. Elias stood by the door, stunned and shaking, watching small voices fill a space he thought would remain empty forever. "Papa?" the boy said quietly, testing the word like it was something precious. Elias's throat closed. The girl stepped forward, holding out the rattle. "Mama said to give you this," she whispered. "Said you made it for us. Said you'd remember." He took it with trembling hands. He remembered every cut of the wood, every hour spent shaping it, every dream he had carved into it. He remembered everything. The children watched him, waiting, hoping, believing more than he ever dared to. Elias sank slowly into the nearest chair, unable to hold himself upright. "How long?" he whispered hoarsely. "Have you been looking for me?" 3 years, the girl answered softly. "Mama said we couldn't stop. Not until we found home. 3 years. Through snow. Through towns. Through strangers. Just to find him." Elias bowed his head into his hands. A broken sound escaped him, half sob, half prayer. The girl came closer, placed a small hand over his. "Mama said you'd still be waiting," she murmured. "Said the lantern would still be burning." He lifted his head slowly, eyes wet. "Is she really coming?" The girl nodded without hesitation. She promised. And for the first time in 3 winters, Elias felt something stir inside him. Something warm. Something terrifying. Something almost like hope. Elias didn't trust his legs for a long while. He sat there in the dim glow of the lantern, staring at the 2 children warming their hands by the fire. The cabin, for so long a tomb of silence, felt almost alive again. Actually alive, with breath and movement and tiny voices whispering quietly to each other. He wasn't ready to speak yet, and the children seemed to understand that, settling near the fire the way cold travelers do. Uninvited by words, but welcomed by warmth. The boy, small and serious, set a small bundle on his lap and began unwrapping it carefully, layer by layer like it was something sacred. Elias watched, breath caught. The final cloth fell away to reveal a wooden horse, identical to the one on Elias's mantle but newer, carved more recently. The boy held it out with both hands. "Mama made me carry it," he whispered. "Said I had to show you. Said you'd know." Elias took the horse, palms trembling. The smooth cedar was lighter than the one he carved years ago, but the design, the little notches, the shape of the legs, the little curve to the mane, was unmistakable. Clara had copied his style, like she'd been holding on to the memory of his hands, and the initials carved inside the belly of the horse, small, neat, careful, were a perfect match. EW plus CW, same as always. Elias shut his eyes, pressing the carving against his forehead. He felt the children watching him, their breaths soft, anxious, waiting. He placed the wooden horse down gently. "What are your names?" he asked finally, voice raw. The girl straightened. "I'm Eliza," she said. "Mama named me after the wildflowers she liked on the hillside." The boy sniffed once, then lifted his head. "I'm Thomas," he said. Elias's breath faltered. Thomas, the name he had chosen for their son, the name he had whispered to Clara's belly the night before she went into labor. Clara remembered. The children watched him closely, as if every tiny shift of his expression mattered to them. "Have you eaten anything?" Elias asked. Eliza nodded quickly. "We had bread last night." "Not much. Thomas gave most to me." She glanced at her brother and frowned at him. "Even though I told him not to." Thomas shrugged. "You were cold." Elias stood abruptly because he had to move, had to do something with the ache swelling in his chest, the way it made his ribs feel too tight to hold breath. He crossed to the small pantry and pulled down whatever he had. Dried apples, leftover stew, bread a little too hard for comfort. The children didn't care. They ate like hunger was a familiar thing. Elias leaned against the counter, arms crossed, just watching them, studying them in every blink, their mannerisms, the way they sat too close to the fire like travelers used to sleeping outside, the way their eyes flicked often toward the door, half expecting someone to burst in or drag them back. He didn't ask more questions yet, didn't dare. When their bellies were finally full, Eliza wiped her fingers on her coat and looked up with those two familiar blue eyes. "Papa," she said softly. Elias's breath hitched. He hadn't heard that word spoken in this house. Not ever. "That's a big word," he whispered. Eliza nodded solemnly. "Mama said it was yours. She said it belonged to you. So we saved it." Thomas shifted closer, gaze steady in a way that reminded Elias painfully of Clara. "She said you'd be scared." Elias let out a shaky laugh, the first sound like that he'd made in years. "She was right," he murmured. Eliza looked toward the door, then back at Elias. "Do you want to know where Mama is?" Elias sat slowly, the weight of the question pressing into his bones. "Yes," he whispered. The children exchanged a glance, a whole conversation passing silently between them. Eliza spoke. "She's close," she said, "but she couldn't come with us yet. Her legs hurt too much after the long ride, and the doctor in town said she needed rest." Elias tensed. "She's hurt?" "Not hurt," Eliza said quickly. "Just tired. The doctor said she's walked too much for someone who got so sick before." Sick. The word hit like a hammer. What kind of sickness?" Thomas lifted his head. "Mama got a fever after we were born. A real bad one. She almost died." His small hands twisted together. "People thought she did. They told her that you left before she woke up." Elias closed his eyes. "She almost died. He buried her in his heart because someone told him she had." Eliza's voice softened, careful. "Mama said when she woke up, they told her she didn't have anyone. No husband, no family, no home. But she didn't believe them." Thomas nodded. "She said she could feel you breathing somewhere." Elias's throat burned. He stood abruptly and paced toward the window, gripping the sill so tightly his knuckles whitened. Snow fell in soft spirals beyond the glass, the old road buried in white silence. "She looked for you," Eliza said behind him. "Everywhere." "How long?" Elias whispered. 3 years, Thomas answered. "We went from town to town, slept in barns, in churches, in people's attics. Mama worked in kitchens and sewed clothes to pay for food. People helped us sometimes. Sometimes they didn't." Eliza added quietly. "She never stopped asking. Your name, your height, the way you laughed." Elias braced both hands against the window frame, forehead pressed against the cold glass. Clara had been alive, searching for him, while he'd been here, burying himself under routine and grief and denial. "Why didn't she send a letter?" Elias asked, voice breaking. Eliza answered. "She did. Lots. But they kept coming back. Mama said someone must have not wanted them to reach you." Elias turned. "What do you mean?" Eliza frowned. The doctor who helped her after we were born. He didn't want her to leave. Said traveling wasn't safe. Said she should stay there. She looked away. Mama said he kept the letters. For months. Maybe years. Elias's jaw tightened. Why? Thomas shrugged. Mama said lonely people sometimes do bad things. Elias's stomach clenched. He had the sudden urge to saddle his horse right now and ride to whatever town held that doctor. But he forced himself still. The children needed calm, not the rage curling low in his chest. He knelt down in front of them. When is she coming? He whispered. Tomorrow. At dawn, Eliza said confidently. She promised. We came first because the road is too cold. And Mama said she didn't want you to not believe. Elias swallowed hard. Tomorrow. He would see her tomorrow. If he had any tears left, they would have fallen then. Instead, he simply nodded. The children began to look around the room with that quiet curiosity of kids who've never belonged anywhere long enough to relax. Eliza drifted toward the cradle in the corner. She reached out and touched the quilt. Did Mama make this? She asked. Elias nodded. She did. Eliza ran her fingers across the stitches, the careful shapes, the small embroidered flowers, the initials in the corner. Her eyes softened. She made something like this for Thomas once, she whispered. But we lost it when we left the Mercy House. Thomas came closer too, looking around at the cabin, at the shelves, the mantels, the chair by the fire. This place feels like her, he said quietly. Elias had to turn away for a moment. The children explored further, gently, respectfully, as though aware they'd entered a place sacred and fragile. Thomas approached the workbench in the corner, where Elias kept his carving tools arranged by size. The boy stared at them with quiet fascination. Can I? He asked. Elias gave a small nod and handed him a block of soft pine. Thomas took it with reverence, rubbing the smooth surface with his thumbs. Elias grabbed some sandpaper, placed it in the boy's hand. Start with this, he murmured. Long strokes. Follow the grain. Thomas nodded with a seriousness too big for a child his size, then began sanding carefully. Eliza found the rocking chair. Clara's chair. She touched its armrest, then settled lightly onto it. She used to talk about this chair, Eliza whispered. Said you made it for her birthday. Said it creaked in one spot, but she liked that because it reminded her of you trying to fix it late at night when you thought she was asleep. Elias let out a breathy laugh, one that cracked halfway through. She always caught me, he said. Eliza smiled faintly. She says she caught you the day she fell in love with you. Elias shut his eyes. This was too much, and not enough, and everything he'd ever wanted. After a while, Thomas looked up from his sanding. Can we stay? He asked. Just until Mama comes. Elias went still. The room. The fire, the children, the hope. He exhaled slowly. You can stay, he said, voice low and certain, for as long as you need. Thomas broke into the smallest, softest smile. Eliza clasped her hands together. Do we have rooms? Elias stood and led them down the small hallway. 2 doors, side by side, covered in dust until today. He pushed one open. The sunlight caught the tiny carved details Clara once painted along the sill. Eliza gasped softly. There are windows, she whispered. Just like Mama said. Thomas went to the next room, unloading his small worn blanket onto the bed with care. Elias stood in the doorway of their rooms, hands stuffed into his pockets because he didn't know what else to do with them. He watched the children settle in, timidly at first, then with the warmth of kids who felt safe for the first time in a long time. When they finally returned to the kitchen, the sky outside had begun to darken. Evening arrived with snowfall drifting heavy and soft. Elias made them both warm milk. They drank slowly, eyelids blinking heavier and slower. Thomas leaned against the side of the chair, trying hard not to fall asleep. Eliza curled her legs beneath her and watched Elias from across the table. Papa, she whispered again. He inhaled sharply. Yes? Eliza hesitated. Will you still be here in the morning? Elias crouched beside her chair and took her tiny, cold hand into his. I'm not going anywhere, he whispered. You're safe here. Eliza nodded, her breath shaky with relief. Thomas climbed into Elias's lap without asking, curling against his chest, like he'd been doing it his whole life. Elias didn't move for a long time, afraid the boy would disappear if he blinked. "Your mama is coming," Elias whispered into Thomas's hair. "I believe you," Thomas mumbled sleepily. "She said you would." They both fell asleep, one in his chair, one in his arms. Elias carried them to their beds, tucking Eliza in first. She murmured something about a star and Clara singing. Elias brushed her hair aside gently. He carried Thomas next. The boy murmured, "Good night, Papa," mid-dream. Elias nearly broke. When both children slept soundly, Elias returned to the window. Snow drifted down the old road in silent sheets, and for the first time in 3 years, the lantern in his window didn't feel like a symbol of grief. It felt like a guide, for someone who was finally finding her way home. Elias pressed his hand to the cold glass. "Come back to me, Clara," he whispered. "I'm here. I never left." The lantern burned bright through the dark. Tomorrow would come, and with it, Clara. She arrived at the hour when the world was still, folding itself between night and dawn, when shadows loosened and the snow took on the faint color of old pewter. Clara came along the road like someone stitched back together, shoulders bent from travel, boots salted and ragged, hair braided down her back with a ribbon that had seen better days. She moved with the crooked, cautious gait of a woman who had learned to measure every step against pain and hope. When she saw the light in Elias's window through the drifted veil of snow, she stopped for a long time and simply looked. The lantern burned bright against the gray, a narrow promise against the wide white. She touched her chest, where something heavy thudded as if trying to escape, and then tamped it down with both hands. She had not imagined this many times. The light, the cabin, the man inside, without counting the cost to breathe. Eliza was awake before the dawn broke. She was sitting at the kitchen table, small chin resting on folded arms, watching the road through the frosted glass because that was what waiting looked like when waiting was a small, bright thing inside you. Thomas lay curled in the cradle of Elias's coat on the chair, breathing slow and whole. When Clara rounded the bend and halted with snow clinging to the hem of her skirts, Eliza pressed both palms to the glass and let out the sound of happiness that children do, a sharp, pure whoop that split the morning. The noise came to Elias like an animal scenting home. He woke stiff, hurried into his boots without thinking, and opened the door to the dawn before he could tell his hands to stop shaking. The wind stole his breath in a single hot bite, and then he saw her. Time had rearranged itself around her face. There were more lines now, and the bloom of youth had thinned to something that fit, the shape of her life, scars of fever, the pale stubbornness of someone who'd been ill and then forced to repair herself from inside out. But her eyes were the same, clear and blue as river ice at sunbreak. They held him with a steadiness that made the world shrink to the space between two people. "Elias," she said. The name spilled out like a prayer and a claim at once. He could only stand there and let the sound of her say his name be true. She stepped forward, slow and bewildered by the solidity of him. For a moment she reached out and didn't touch him, like she was testing whether her fingers would find flesh and not mist. When her hand finally landed on his coat, the heat was immediate and real. She folded into him like a shore folding into water. Around them the snow made no sound. Inside the lantern shone like a small sun. Clara smelled of smoke and rain, of the Mercy House's lavender and soap. Her hands were rough in places where they had been idle, and soft in others where they had worked at sewing or mending. She held a small bundle pressed to her chest. "I told you I would come," she said, voice thick with things that had no easy names. "I told them I would find my way home." Elias pressed his forehead to hers. He could feel the slow undercurrent of years in the groove beside her ear, the soft rasp where fever had stolen tone. He tasted salt on her lips and the memory of the nights he had spent whispering to the cradle that never rocked. The world lurched and righted. "You came," he said, and the words were small, because everything felt too large to fit into speech. Clara's laugh was a ragged thing, half surprise and half grief. "I walked until strangers fed me, until mothers took me aside and gave me a place to sit. I sewed, Elias, I sewed, and I asked. They told me you were gone." She swallowed. "They told me to stay where I was until I forgot. Elias felt a warmth flare and die in his chest. "Why did you stay?" Clara looked up at the lantern light and blinked. "Because I had to rest. I could not walk anymore without help. The fever, it did something to me. I woke and the world was different, and the man I loved was already a ghost." She hesitated and then, with the trust that used to be the foundation of everything between them, she unfolded the small bundle. Inside lay a stack of folded papers, edges browned, tied with a thread that had once been red. She pressed the papers into his hand. "Letters," she said. "I tried. I wrote and I sent them. They kept coming back." He opened the top page with numb fingers. The ink had run in places where tears had landed. The handwriting wavered, but the words were fierce. "Elias," it began. They were her pleas and maps, and small stories of a woman trying to stitch her life back to the man who'd left not knowing she was still breathing. He read it once, then again, and then his hand curled into a fist. The letters had dates from months and months earlier, postmarks tied to towns he had never visited. One folded paper had a note from Mercy House, sent to a friend of Clara Ward, and stamped by a doctor's name. Elias recognized Dr. Herrick. Under it, a short scrawl explained that the patient had been placed in their care. Travel not recommended. No forwarding address on file. Elias's throat closed around that name like a noose. "Why didn't they send them?" he asked. He hardly recognized the hardness of his voice. Clara's face darkened. "They said it was dangerous for me to travel. They said I should stay put until strong. They said you would come. But after a while, someone decided it wasn't safe to let us leave. They kept the letters. They told me you had moved on." The lantern's light trembled against the snow. "I wrote again," Clara whispered. "And again. I stamped each letter with every penny we could scrape together. The road was long and people were mean sometimes, but most were kind. We slept under porches. We begged. I sewed to get bread. When I found it, the post that kept sending the letters back, I begged the woman there and she cried and said she could not. She had a ledger. Dr. Herrick says no forwarding," she said. "He says it's a shame, but some things get decided for folks." Elias's jaw moved like a slow machine. "Herrick," he repeated. "He's the one." Clara's eyes lit with a sudden fierce light. "Herrick was supposed to help me. He looked me over and told me I was strong enough for light work. He took a coin and said he would see I had what I needed. But when the fever broke and I asked about my letters, he stalled. He said I was too ill for the road. He said he would write to you himself, to tell you how I was. But he did not. He promised things he did not keep. Anger, low and furious, laced through Elias so sharp he felt cold. "I kept a ledger of my own," Clara said, voice trembling. "I remembered names of men who helped us. I wrote them down in the margins because I was afraid I would forget. One evening I found a note hidden under the bed. It was a bill. A man named Hargrove had paid the Mercy House for a quiet disposal of an unclaimed body. They wrote a name on it, a woman who had passed. But the letters, they mislabeled them. I confronted the man. He said the world is messy. He said I should be grateful for the food and the bed." Tears came then, slow and hot. "You stayed while I was grieving for you," Elias said, and he couldn't keep the ragged edge out of his voice. "I left because they told me you were gone. I buried you in my heart because the paper said so." Clara covered his hand with both of hers and looked at him with the absoluteness of someone for whom survival had taught blunt lessons. "You buried what you thought you had," she said softly. "But which of us would not have done the same? I begged every traveler for news of the man who built a lantern. I heard rumors that you had moved west. I heard you had gone to a town where you could not be found. I heard the worst. But seeing the lantern in the window, after all those winters, I thought perhaps the world had kept one bright thing for me." She reached up and tucked a snowy curl behind his ear. "I thought of the nights you promised us a life here. I thought of the cradle and the horse. I thought it might be time. I walked until my legs did not want to, until the Mercy House gave me a bundle of bread and said, 'Go before it's too late.' I borrowed a coat. I came. He wanted to ask 100 questions and no question at all. He wanted to strike down the men who had lied, to gather every paper and fetch every postmark and shout until the world admitted its mistake. But the children slept inside, and Clara's shoulders were shaking with the memory of how almost everything had been taken from her. Instead, he drew her into the kitchen and set the kettle to boil. They stood there while it whistled, hands touching sometimes, then pulling away, then touching again like they were remapping each other's skin. Eliza and Thomas woke to the sound of footsteps and voices that were adult and familiar, and melted halfway into joy. They tumbled out of bed and rushed toward the doorway. When they saw Clara, all the small caution of children vanished. Eliza flung herself into her mother's skirt, and Thomas climbed up to bury his face in her apron. Clara knelt and gathered them into her arms, whispering their names like a benediction. For a long time the three of them swayed in an embrace. "You came," Eliza said into Clara's sleeve. "You kept your promise." Clara's voice shook. "I did. I kept my promise, and I walked until my legs learned the prayer of it." Neighbors came eventually because word moves fast across a snow-wrapped settlement. Old Mrs. Brennan knocked, then bustled in with a basket of steaming rolls and a look on her face that said she had been waiting for this door to open for 5 years. Others hovered on the road, cautious and hopeful in equal measure, bringing kindness and suspicion bundled like winter things. There were questions, sharp ones. How could this be? How could a woman declared dead be standing at the doorstep? Who had fostered this false news? Dr. Herrick's name found lips that were not gentle. Men frowned and clenched. Women cried and hugged strangers. Children giggled at the idea of a miracle, and then looked away at the gravity of the adults. Elias stood with Clara in the center of the room, both of them small in the wide heat of the kitchen and enormous at once. Where there had been silence, there was now story, and story pulls at edges like hands picking at a seam. People argued, some voices small and rational, some loud and blustering. But for the most part, neighbors offered warmth and shelter and the quiet help of people who knew what it means to keep a family from falling apart in winter. As the day unwound, Clara told her tale again, more measured, while Elias listened and sometimes interrupted with a question that always mattered. They spoke of the Mercy House, of the Ledger snares, of letters intercepted by men who thought themselves keepers of fate. Elias promised to ride to Herrick's town in the morning once the road cleared. Not with a gun, not with curse-laden threats, but with a ledger and the stubbornness of a man who would not let lies stand. Clara watched him arrange this, the way one watches a man prepare to fight with grain and law rather than rage. She saw steadiness in him that had nothing to do with the lantern and everything, to do with the promise he had once made and kept, to keep the lamp burning. Night fell with a slower breath than it had these last 3 years. The cabin filled with the smells of bread and stew and the low, ordinary sounds of people passing plates and swapping quiet laughter. The children drifted between laps like small planets. The neighbors left later, some shaking their heads in wonder, some wiping their eyes. When the house finally emptied, when the thick hush of night settled with the weight of a full thing, Elias and Clara found themselves alone by the lantern. They sat at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. Outside, the snow lay like a blanket pressed to the earth, and the land breathed under it. "You're here," Clara whispered at last. "Yes," Elias said. "I am." She touched his hand, fingers tracing the scar on his palm, where he once nearly cut himself while building the cradle. "We lost time," she said, "but we have each other now." He lifted her hand and placed it against his heart. "We do," he agreed. "We have children. We have a house. We have a lantern that never went out." Clara's smile was small and tentative and made of brave stitches. "What will we do about the years?" she asked. He thought of all the things that had hardened into him. The habit of waiting, the distance that had grown like frost between them. He thought of pages and postmarks and men who had decided fate for others. He thought of the 2 small bodies asleep beneath quilts in the next room. "We will make new habits," he said finally. "We will plant what we missed last spring. We will name days of thanks even for the small things. We will sit and tell the children the stories we remember and make up the parts we lost." She nodded, and he saw the exhaustion give way to determination. "I will teach them to sew," she said. "And you will teach them to carve." They both laughed very softly, and it sounded like forgiveness. Outside toward the east, a line of cloud began to bleed light. The lantern in the window burned steady against a world that had seen too much and still did not give up trying to come right. They slept that night tangled like people who had been ripped and seamed back, anchored by each other's warmth. For once Elias did not wake at every sound. For once Clara let the house hold her. The children slept in a peace that felt like protection rather than temporary shelter. In the morning, Elias would set out toward Town to ask questions, in the only language some men respect, proof and witness. In the meantime, he had a house to guard and a family he had nearly lost and finally found again. The lantern burned on. Its light did not ask for explanation. It simply stayed, steady as a vow. The morning Elias set out for Town, the sky was a low, heavy gray, the kind that promised either a storm or a reckoning. Maybe both. Clara stood on the porch holding a shawl around her shoulders. The children pressed against her sides. Elias tightened the saddle and checked the straps twice, though everything was already perfect. He kept thinking if his hands were busy enough, he wouldn't look at Clara's face and feel the gravity of what he was about to do. Clara stepped down from the porch, snow crunching beneath her worn boots. Her breath formed soft clouds in the still air. "You'll come back?" she asked. Elias touched her cheek, gentle as a man touching a miracle. "Always." She nodded once, strong despite the heaviness in her eyes. "Be careful." He leaned down, kissed her softly, a slow, certain kind of kiss. The children watched. Eliza smiling through the worry, Thomas gripping Clara's skirt like he wasn't entirely sure the world would behave while Elias was gone. Elias knelt, eye level with them. "You two guard your mama," he said. Thomas puffed his tiny chest. "We will." Eliza nodded fiercely, grabbing her mother's hand. "We'll keep the lantern lit." Elias smiled at that. He kissed Clara's forehead once more, mounted his horse, and rode into the pale dawn. The road was long and frozen. Snow clung to the horse's hooves. The wind bit at Elias's coat. But something inside him had hardened in the night, a slow-burning fire that no winter could smother. He carried Clara's letters inside his coat, the papers warm against his chest, like small living witnesses. Hours passed before the town rose on the horizon. Mercy Ridge, a cluster of buildings tucked into the fold of the hills, familiar in the worst way. Elias rode past the general store, the blacksmith. The saloon still shuttered for the morning. People stared as he passed, some nodding, some whispering. Word traveled too fast in small places. He stopped in front of the Mercy House, white paint peeling, windows fogged, a crooked sign. He dismounted and tied his horse. The door creaked when he pushed it open. Inside, the faint smell of lavender mixed with disinfectant and something older, something that reminded him of grief. A nurse at the desk looked up, startled. "Can I help ye?" "I need to speak with Dr. Herrick," Elias said. His voice carried the calm of a man, ready to stay standing, even if the house collapsed. The nurse hesitated. "He's not seeing anyone right now. He's very—" Elias walked past her. She called after him, but he didn't stop. He found Herrick in his office, bent over a ledger, glasses low on the bridge of his nose. Age had bracketed the man's mouth with lines of worry and habit. But the moment he lifted his head and saw Elias, his face blanched. "Hartwell?" he breathed. Is it truly you?" Elias shut the door behind him. "My wife," he said. "Clara Ward." Herrick swallowed. She survived." "She did," Elias answered. 3 years she survived. Woke alone in this place. Wrote letters you never sent." Herrick's eyes darted to the ledger like it could shield him. "I did what I thought best," he said. "She was weak, disoriented. A woman in her condition." Elias took one step forward. Herrick's words died. "I read the letters," Elias said softly. "Every one you kept. Every one she begged you to send." "She wasn't ready," Herrick murmured. "The road was hers to take," Elias said. "Not yours to keep her from." Herrick's face collapsed in on itself. He sat slowly in his chair. "I feared she'd die on the road," he whispered. "She could barely walk. Fever had taken months from her. And she mourned you. Fiercely. She clenched your name like a wound." "She didn't die," Elias said. "She walked through snow and hunger and strangers to find me." Herrick's voice broke. "I was wrong." "Yes," Elias said. "You were. Silence fell, thick as dust. Finally, Herrick opened his drawer and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Every letter Clara had written. He slid them across the table. "I kept them," he choked out, "not to harm her. To protect her." Elias took the letters, weighing them in his hand. They felt heavier than guilt, lighter than forgiveness. "I'm not here to destroy your life," Elias said quietly, "but you'll not lie for Mercy again. Not to her. Not to anyone." Herrick nodded, tears hitting the ledger. "I'll never meddle again." Elias turned to leave. "Hartwell?" Herrick called softly. Elias paused. "Tell her." Herrick wiped his eyes. "Tell her I am sorry." Elias didn't answer. The door shut behind him, the sound final as winter. He returned as dusk bled into the hills. The road home felt shorter, warmer. The lantern in the window was a tiny firefly in the distance guiding him. When he reached the cabin, Clara burst out the door before he could dismount. Eliza and Thomas followed, their faces bright as candles. "You came back," Clara whispered. "Always," Elias said. She threw her arms around him. The children wrapped around them both. That warmth, 4 bodies pressed together, thawed something frozen in Elias's soul. Inside, the cabin glowed. Bread warmed on the hearth. Pine logs crackled. The lantern flickered with renewed life. "What happened?" Clara asked when they sat at the table, the children leaning close, listening. Elias placed the letters gently before her. Her breath caught. Slowly, she reached out and touched the worn paper. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the top letter, the first she ever sent. She pressed it to her chest, as if it were a piece of herself returned. "He kept them," she whispered. "He did," Elias said. "But they're home now." Clara closed her eyes, letting out a long breath. "Then I can stop searching," she murmured. "You're home," Elias said. "We all are." Eliza climbed into her lap. Thomas settled against Elias's shoulder. Outside, snow fell soft as feathers, blanketing the world in clean white. Clara set down the letters and looked up at Elias. "What do we do now?" He reached across the table, took her hand, and laced their fingers. "We live," he said. "Slowly, honestly, together. No more running. No more waiting behind windows for the world to fix itself." Clara smiled, a tired, radiant, full-hearted smile. "We plant in spring," she said. "We build a bigger table," Elias replied. "We fill this house with noise," Eliza chimed. "We carve toys," Thomas added. Elias let out a soft laugh. "Yes," he said. "All of that." That night, the cabin was no longer a quiet place echoing with ghosts. It was alive with movement. Clara humming while she folded blankets, the children bickering softly over which room should be theirs. Elias stoking the fire while watching his family with the quiet disbelief of a blessed man. Later, when the children fell asleep, Eliza curled like a kitten beneath her quilt, Thomas clutching the wooden horse. Elias and Clara stepped onto the porch. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear, crisp, filled with stars sharp as diamonds. The lantern burned at the window, but now its purpose had shifted. No longer a beacon of longing, but one of belonging. Clara leaned into Elias, her head on his shoulder. "I used to dream of this porch," she whispered. "Of this view, of your arms, even in the fever, even when I didn't know if the world was real or memory." He tightened his arm around her. "You didn't give up." "I wanted to," she admitted, "but the children needed me. And somewhere inside, something whispered that you were out there. Hurting too." Elias kissed the top of her head. "I was," he said. "Every day." Clara pulled back slightly and cupped his cheek. "We lost years, Eli." "We did," he agreed. "But we didn't lose each other." "Not really." She nodded, tears shining on her lashes. "We're home." "We're home," Elias echoed. A single star shot across the sky, a thin arc of silver. Clara leaned forward and kissed him, slow and sure, like sealing a promise neither of them would break again. He kissed her back, steady and warm, hands cradling her face as though the world had just been knit back into place. Inside, the children breathed the easy breath of a safe home. Outside, the snow lay untouched. The night wrapped around them gently, the way mercy wraps itself around people who have been hurt too long. The land, cold, patient, ancient, held their footprints like a witness. And when they finally went inside, the lantern flickered once, then steadied. Its vigil was finished, its purpose fulfilled. But its light stayed, because now it wasn't waiting for anyone. It was welcoming them home,